supposed to be
Good evening and welcome to ACADIA 2020 Distributed Proximities, and thank you for joining us. My name is Shelby Doyle and I am one of the co-chairs of the 2020 ACADIA Conference and an assistant professor of architecture at Iowa State University. I would like to begin by thanking our sponsors and the ACADIA community for making this event possible. I also want to make you aware of a few things before we get started. This session is being recorded and will be available to registered conference attendees for viewing after the event through November 30th. Conference attendees will be able to access the recordings afterwards using the same link that you used to join this webinar, accessible via our conference website. This session is also being streamed live to the public on ACADIA's YouTube channel. This event is a Zoom webinar. Only the moderator and presenters are able to participate and broadcast their video and audio. Webinar attendees are able to watch the session and contribute via chat and Q&A interfaces. Conference attendees are welcome to use the chat interface during the event, but we ask that all attendees remain respectful in your comments and observe ACADIA's code of conduct. If attendees have specific questions for the presenters, please use the Q&A function to ask your question. Questions in the Q&A will be processed, selected, and asked by the moderator. In some cases, the moderator may invite attendees with a specific question to activate their audio and ask the question live. Thank you for your cooperation, and we hope that you enjoy the session. I'm delighted to welcome you to the second keynote event of ACADIA 2020, a conversation on data and bias between Ruha Benjamin, Orit Halpern, and David Benjamin. As computational design practices become increasingly dependent on data collection and processes, a critical reflection on the ethical, cultural, and political implications of data-driven design practices is necessary. Abundant commercial smart home appliances promise the comforts of a fully automated living environment populated by ambient sensing devices at the quote-unquote negligible price of the user's personal data. Implementation of machine learning and cloud-based computing strategies marketed as inherently intelligent with a hint of mystery and magic present black box solutions based on hundreds of gigabytes of collected data. Data-driven processes create the false promise of objectivity, fairness, and neutrality. In this context, designers must critically engage with the questions of inherited bias and investigate responsible design approaches to working with and/or against data collection, data processing, and algorithmic automation. This keynote event brings together scholars and design practitioners who engage critically with questions of machine learning, data collection and data bias, and its implications in design in a broader socio-political context. And before I introduce our keynote speakers, I want to invite you to visit the conference bookshelf located in the menu found on the left-hand side of the website. Here we have compiled a reading list sourced from the keynote participants as a resource for conference attendees to learn more about their research, and also a way to expand the conversations of the conference to classrooms and practices. Now to introduce tonight's keynotes. Beginning with Ruha Benjamin. Ruha Benjamin is an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton University, founder of the Just Data Lab, and author of People's Science, Bodies and Rights on the Stem Cell Frontier, and Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code, among many other publications. Her work investigates the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology, with a focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity, health and justice, knowledge and power. Professor Benjamin is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships, including from the American Council of Learned Science Societies, National Science Foundation, Institute for Advanced Study, and the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. Next, we have Orit Halpern, who is an associate professor in sociology and anthropology at Concordia University. She completed her PhD at Harvard, and she has published widely and has held numerous visiting scholar positions, including at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science in Berlin and at Duke University. She is currently finishing a book that is a history and theory of smartness, examining the changing relationship between ecology, finance, and artificial intelligence. Her future research investigates how we are designing planetary futures and managing uncertainty through an array of techniques ranging from biomimetic design to artificial intelligence. She is also the director of the Speculative Life Research Cluster, a laboratory bridging the arts, environmental, and biosciences in the social sciences. And then we will have our respondent, David Benjamin, who is a founding principal of The Living and associate professor at Columbia GSAPP. His work focuses on expanding the definition of environmental sustainability through the frameworks of biology, computation, and a circular economy. He and the firm have won many design prizes, including the Emerging Voices Award from the Architecture League, the Young Architects Program from the Museum of Modern Art and MoMA PS1, and a Wholesome Sustainability Award. Recently, Benjamin appeared in Rolling Stone as one of the 25 people shaping the future, and The Living was ranked third on Fast Company's list of the world's 10 most innovative architecture firms. Recent projects include the Princeton University Embodied Computation Lab, a new building for research on robotics and the Internet of Things, Pier 35 Eco Park, a 200-foot long floating pier in the East River that changes color according to water quality, and Hi-Fi, a branching tower for MoMA PS1, made of a new type of biodegradable brick. The format for this keynote conversation will be presentations by Ruha Benjamin and Orit Halpern, and then a presentation and response by David Benjamin, followed by Q&A in the remaining time. And with that, please join me in welcoming our first speaker, Ruha Benjamin.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. I'm going to try to share my screen. I think, Shelby, you might have to stop sharing first, and then I'll be able to open up. Wonderful. All right. There we go. So I really can't think of two people who I'm more excited to be in conversation with, Orit and David. I'm huge fans of their work, admirers of their work. And so it's really a thrill to be part of this convening. So thank you so much for inviting me. So I thought I'd spend my initial remarks trying to situate how I approach this nexus of issues, data and bias, both in terms of a sociological context, and historical context. So adding just a bit of breadth and depth to these terms, and then we'll be able to connect the dots, I think, in the Q&A. And so as much as I can do in 20 minutes. So let me begin with this idea of 2020 vision, and think together about how racism among other axes of domination and difference, distorts our vision. It distorts not only what we see out there, our external view, our ability or inability to understand the social patterns around us, to understand the multiple crises we face, but it also distorts our interpersonal vision, how we see one another at an individual level, and even how we understand ourselves. So our internal vision. And so at all of these levels, I'd like us to wrestle with how that distortion is produced, was produced, and an ongoing production of this way of seeing and the way that racism distorts it. And so we have numerous examples, of course, we could pull from any headline or hashtag that reveals to us how these distortions operate in the context of various institutions, namely policing and our carceral system. And so this is just one example from a few years ago where this image was leaked to the press, the faces that Miami PD uses for target practice. And so in this case, we see that the spectacular forms of racial violence that we witness that make it into our sort of collective consciousness and conversation is predicated by this ongoing everyday form of violence and anti-Blackness. And even with that kind of dominant distortion at play, there are always individuals, movements, organizations that are working to refute it and to try to imagine a different way of seeing and being in the world. And so in this particular case, clergy in Miami, predominantly white clergy, in fact, used the hashtag #UseMeInstead as a way to call out the hypocrisy of law enforcement and to really make us confront this everyday anti-Blackness that usually is hidden behind the scenes. And so with this, we understand the kind of way that this may operate in the context of policing. What's I think less well known is how it permeates even the kind of do-gooding professions, whether it's healthcare or education in this case. Some colleagues at Yale School of Education put eye tracking technology on preschool teachers and had them look at little children playing together and told them, to prime them to look for the challenging behavior, and the teacher's attention, the vast majority, invariably went to the little Black boys in the playgroup, even though they were behaving the same as all the other children. And so whether we're talking about policing or preschool, adulthood or childhood, this everyday anti-Blackness distorts how people are seen and how we understand ourselves. And so I think for me, stepping back from all of these different arenas, it's important to consistently remind ourselves that this particular distortion is not natural or inevitable, that has been produced, that is to say, it's been designed deliberately over time, and in some cases now unwittingly recreated and reproduced. So thinking historically for just a moment, we should return to figures like Georges Cuvier, French naturalist, who was one of what we might call the architects of race and racism. And so in this architecture, it's important to understand that the pillars of the architecture of race is Blackness and whiteness. To understand the hierarchy of white supremacy, these two pillars are key. So Cuvier wrote, "The white race with oval face, straight hair and nose, to which the civilized people of Europe belong, and which appear to us the most beautiful of all, is also superior to others by its genius, courage, and activity. The Negro race, by contrast, is marked by Black complexion, crest of woolly hair, which he goes on to compare to the monkey tribe, the hordes of which have always remained in the most complete state of barbarism." So there's a lot going on here that we could and should eventually unpack, but for the purposes now, I'll just highlight two things. One, again, is to point to this, the pillars, the way that Blackness and whiteness are the foil of one another. The second thing is the way that bodies serve as a template for these other qualities of civilization and culture, behavior and intelligence. And so the importance of naturalizing racial hierarchy, whether that naturalization happens in terms of embodiment, the way that hair, nose, jaw, every single aspect of the body is dissected to produce a natural vision of racial difference and hierarchy. And the importance of this is the more that something is naturalized, the more that we regard it as immutable and unchanging, the less likely we are to question it and thereby try to transform it. And so it's this way of thinking about bodies as a naturalizing mechanism, but also, and I won't get into this now, it's important to note in light of this conference that geography is another mechanism of naturalizing racial difference and hierarchy. Creating a spatialization of racial difference is key to the ongoing maintenance of white supremacy today. And so if we shift gears now from history to the present, thinking about how this distortion permeates our visual culture, again, we could pick on many different examples. Here's just one as a kind of placeholder for how popular culture in particular reproduces the difference between Black and white, as we see here between LeBron and Giselle, but also evoking these qualities of culture and personality that were so important for Cuvier. And so here we see that the Vogue cover is mirroring this World War I propaganda poster, in which the brute in that case were the Germans, and here it's the Black male bodies, even down to the pose, the hand position, the sneaker choice, the growl, and that only makes full sense in contrast to the smile of Giselle, to the frailty, to the innocence, to the beauty. And so again, thinking about how that architecture of race that Cuvier helped to script continues to permeate our visual culture and distortions today, which brings us, of course, to technology. And so when we think about, again, a wide variety of examples, different kinds of systems we could point to, I'll just put a placeholder here for a simple exercise to go to Google Images and type in unprofessional hairstyles and professional hairstyles, and you begin to see a pattern emerge that Black women's natural hair is coded literally unprofessional, a la uncivilized, going back to Cuvier. With some exceptions, of course, you see the Hunger Games lady over here on your left, Beyonce on your right, but the general pattern holds such that technology is mirroring back at us and also deepening and naturalizing these distinctions that actually permeate everyday life. The specific discrimination for Black women's hair is so pervasive that some states have actually had to pass laws or trying to pass laws against this particular form of bias. In California, it's called the Crown Act. And so here again, thinking about the role of technology, a concept that I've written about is the new Jim Code, which is this combination of coded bias and imagined objectivity. And it's that imagined objectivity that makes it so powerful and also dangerous, that we are less likely to question it, precisely because it comes through the mechanism of automated systems. And so this concept is in conversation with a number of other texts and ideas, as noted in the right. The point here is that rather than having a big sign in front of, let's say, a hospital that says for whites only, or the Negro wing, as was the case during the Jim Crow era, the new Jim Code involves the automation of decisions that continue to reproduce this pattern of discrimination. So in this case, some colleagues of mine last year reported this healthcare algorithm affecting millions of people actually leaving Black patients undiagnosed or not receiving a high enough risk score to get the needed resources and attention that would actually help them stay out of the hospital. And so Obermeyer and colleagues, you can read the original report in Science or just go to the research tab of my website to dig into how, in particular, a race neutral algorithm can be deadly. And so the particular system was not taking explicit note of race, but because of the particular model and training data, it had this discriminatory effect. And so within this larger umbrella of the new Jim Code, I've broken the idea down into 4 parts that run from the more obvious types of discrimination that we can kind of see coming, that explicitly seek to amplify social cleavages, to the less obvious, the more insidious, often types of systems that frame themselves as alleviating bias and discrimination, what we might call techno-benevolence. And so each of the chapters in Race After Technology unpack these in some detail. For our purposes now, I'm just going to highlight the coded exposure, the third concept here, with a little more depth, and then move towards conclusion. So coded exposure is this combination of the forms of exclusion that come as a result of technological bias. As you see here, the omission of the darker skinned individual from the lens, but also reminding us that racialized populations are not just harmed through exclusion, but also through predatory inclusion or surveillance and overexposure. And so it's important to keep in mind this combination where you're not only out of sight in some cases, but also in the danger of being too centered and being included without permission. And so to illustrate one side of this dialectic, I'm going to pause for just a 2-minute clip and then resume with some closing thoughts.
Hello? Motion sensors. Motioning. Emotioning. Please sense me.
Oh, one other thing. Lem mentioned that there's something weird going on with the motion sensors in the lab.
Oh, yeah, we replaced all the sensors in the building with a new state-of-the-art system that's gonna save money. It works by detecting light reflected off the skin.
Well, Lem says it doesn't work at all.
Lem's wrong. It does work. Although there is a problem. It doesn't seem to see black people.
The system doesn't see black people?
I know. Weird, huh?
That's more than weird, Veronica. That's basically, well, racist.
The company's position is that it's actually the opposite of racist because it's not targeting black people, it's just ignoring them. They insist the worst people can call it is indifferent.
Nothing. We never should have let that white guy off.
We're 8 black men in an elevator. Of course the white guy's gonna get off. Veronica? Oh, God, this looks way too aggressive.
No, it's okay. I think I know why you're all here. Well, most of you.
I have something prepared. Veronica, you are a terrific boss.
Thank you, Lem. I'll take it from here. Let me start by apologizing on behalf of Viridian for this inexcusable situation.
I laid into Veronica pretty good. I figured it was my only shot, so I took the gloves off.
Wow, that sounds great, Lem. Sounds like you gave the company a really strong message.
Oh, yeah. She said they're working 24/7 to make things right. Can you believe this?
I know, isn't it great? We all get our own free white guys.
You like it?
Yeah. Hey, Ty's the best. He anticipates everything I need. Plus, he picked up my dry cleaning. Oh, and he got this kink out of my neck.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
My white guy sucks.
Well, maybe you're just not using yours right.
Yeah, maybe it's on you, dude.
Shut up, Stu.
I got the worst black guy.
It turned out Lem had also been thinking about the money issue, and he put together some interesting numbers to show us. And then, we all went to speak to management in a language they could understand, within a margin of error of plus or minus 1%. And so, if the company keeps hiring white people to follow black people, to follow white people, to follow black people by
Thursday, June 27th, 2013.
every person on Earth will be working for us. And we don't have the parking for that.
Okay, so this clip from the show Better Off Ted, the clip is called Racial Sensitivity. It brilliantly depicts how a superficial corporate diversity ethos, the prioritization of efficiency over equity, and the default whiteness of tech development all work together to ensure that innovation literally produces containment. The fact that darker skinned employees are unable to use the elevators, open doors, turn the lights on, all treated as a minor inconvenience in service to a greater good. But good for whom is what we have to continuously ask. And their use of the iconic water fountain is part of the genius of the clip, in part because it reminds us that the original segregated water fountain was itself an innovation at the time. And so this idea that innovation necessarily means social progress is really an illusion. Finally, when we think about the main takeaways here that I'd like to put on the table, the first is that racism is productive. And by saying that, I don't, of course, mean that racism is good, but in the literal capacity of racism to produce things of value to some, even as it wreaks havoc on others. We are still, many of us, taught to think of racism as an aberration, a glitch, an accident, an isolated incident, a bad apple, in the backwoods and outdated, rather than as innovative, systemic, diffuse, an attached incident, the entire orchard, in the ivory tower, in the tech industry, forward-looking, productive. In my field of sociology, we say race is socially constructed, but we often fail to state the corollary that racism constructs. The second thing I'd like us to remember is that race and technology shape one another, because more and more people are accustomed to thinking about the way the social and ethical impacts of technology, but that's only half of the story. Social norms, values, structures, all exist prior to any given tech development. So it's not simply the impacts, but the social inputs that make some inventions appear inevitable and desirable, which leads to a third provocation, that imagination is a contested field of action, not an ephemeral afterthought that we have the luxury to dismiss or romanticize, but a resource, a battleground, an input and output of technology and social order. In fact, we should acknowledge that most people are forced to live inside someone else's imagination. And one of the things we have to come to grips with is how the nightmares that many people are forced to endure are the underside of elite fantasies about efficiency, profit, and social control. So racism, among other axes of domination, helps to produce this fragmented imagination where we have misery for some, monopoly for others. This means that for those of us who want to construct a different social reality, one grounded in justice and joy, we can't only critique the underside, we also have to wrestle with the deep investments, the desire even that many people have for social domination. So with that, what do we do? In the next minute and a half, I'd like to just very quickly sketch a few pathways and a few arenas that people are already working in that we can contribute and build on. First, obviously, is to really think about the kinds of legal and regulatory protections that are necessary in light of the new Jim Code or in light of algorithmic discrimination. And so here's just one of many efforts. In this case, it's an algorithmic accountability bill that I think was presented last year and still waiting debate. So secondly is tech accountability from within the tech industry, from among designers. And so there is a number of organizing efforts underway. The hashtag tech won't build it is a good starting point to see the range of refusals that various organizing efforts are creating. So for example, thousands of Google employees condemned the company's collaboration on a Pentagon program that uses AI to make drone strikes more effective. And a growing number of Microsoft employees have been opposed to the company's ICE contract, saying that, quote, as the people who build the technologies that Microsoft profits from, we refuse to be complicit. And as this article published by Science for the People reminds us, contrary to popular narratives, organizing among technical workers has a vibrant history, including engineers and technicians in the 60s and 70s, who fought professionalism, reformism, and individualism to contribute to radical labor organizing. The current tech workers movement, which includes students across our many institutions, can draw from past organizers' strategies and challenges in learning to navigate the complexities and contradictions of organizing in tech today. In terms of education, which I think is a ground zero for planting a more historically and sociologically grounded approach to technology and design, I'll just mention one concrete resource that you all can download, the Advancing Racial Literacy in Tech Handbook. The aim of this intervention is threefold: to develop an intellectual understanding of how structural racism operates in algorithms, social media platforms, and technologies not yet developed, an emotional intelligence concerning how to resolve racially stressful situations within organizations, and a commitment to take action to reduce harms to communities of color. In that spirit, initiatives like Data for Black Lives and the Detroit Community Technology Project are doing just that. Data for Black Lives brings together people working across a number of agencies and organizations in a proactive approach to tech justice. And the Detroit initiative uses technology rooted in community needs, offering support to grassroots networks doing data justice research, including hosting what they call discotheques, discovering technology, which are these multimedia mobile neighborhood workshop fairs that can be adapted in other locales. And so taken together, a growing movement of tech justice organizations all over the world is transforming paranoia about surveillance and technologies into power, galvanizing communities to take a proactive approach to designing the world that they want to live in. And so my final proposition is this: if inequity is woven into the very fabric of our society, that is, we see it from policing to preschool, we see it from computer systems to healthcare systems, then each twist, coil, and code is a chance for us to weave new patterns, practices, and politics. The vastness of the problem that we're up against will be its undoing once we accept that we are pattern makers. Thank you.
Hello, all. So I don't know if you're seeing me, but thank you so much, Ruha. I'm so excited actually to be on this panel with Ruha and David, and also thank you everyone for putting this together and for all of you listening. And I'm really excited for the conversation because while this talk will seem really, really different in many ways, I resonated very, very deeply with Ruha's discussion, particularly around this concept of pattern making and also how we trace and introduce complex histories of racial injustice in our algorithms and kind of act upon them. So today I'm going to talk about planetary bets, which are also planetary biases, in terms of the unfair, asymmetrical, and inequitous distributions of risks and uncertainties at a planetary scale. And I'm not going to talk that much about big data bias as much as I'm going to talk about structural and infrastructural bias under conditions of automation and ubiquitous computing. So as a word of background just about me, I'm a historian of science who works on histories of cybernetics design and the human sciences. And I work a lot on situating and contesting such concepts as smartness and kind of situating the sort of types of control rooms and smart cities that you see here. And in my work, I've largely focused on data aesthetics and governmentality historically to build a genealogy of these contemporary spaces. And I've also been working on things like, for example, how race warfare and violence in American cities was transformed through new strategies in design and data collection into personalization and interactivity, the automation and perhaps technicization of politics, and in fact, perhaps the demos or democracy that have led to so many of our contemporary smart city and big data collecting infrastructures like Hudson Yards. But lately, I've taken these concerns into engaging with ecology and with infrastructure. And while these might not appear to be intuitive places to think about big data, I think that rethinking figure ground landscapes and the boundaries of systems, for example, the urban and the hinterland, or the territories relating extraction, production and consumption zones, says a lot for how we model problems and ultimately how structural injustices, the kind I think we're talking about, are built into big data and machine learning systems. So as you can tell from my photos, I'm sort of a glutton for these large scale infrastructural sites. And aside from less than functional smart cities, I've been doing a lot of work on smart mining. So this is one site, and kind of to make my case, I'm just going to work you through a case study of just one thing I've been working on and also have been teaching on, because one of the things that I'm also going to do in this talk is think actively about what pedagogy might mean today and how ethnographic encounters and historical archives but recombine to produce different ways to narrativize and therefore reimagine the past and the future of the technology. So this is the Malarctic mine in Abitibi, Quebec, near Val d'Or. It's one of the largest open pit mines in Canada, which says a lot because we do a lot of mining in Canada. That's one of the things I learned the minute I moved up here. And because the ore quality is significantly degraded, since there's basically no easy mining left on Earth, the amount being mined is only 1 part per million, which is to say 1 ton of rock for a gram of gold. So you got to dig a whole lot of rocks up to get a little gold, but this is still really profitable. It costs about $650 a gram to mine, and the current price of gold as of this afternoon was $1,906 US. So you can't really lose there. And according to one of the geoengineers I work with, all the metals are running out. So no matter how much we frack or annihilate this planet or what new technologies, a lot of geoengineers agree that pretty much by 2155, even coal will be all out. So it's an even safer bet in that sense. It is also a smart mine. It's fully automated except for the trucks. And the geology surveys involve vast numbers of sensors, a lot of high frequency radio, infrared, and spectroscopy mapping from the air and satellites, and large amounts of modeling and simulation for both the stability and environmental impact, not to mention supply chain optimization. And of course, these are very unstable sites because these are really big holes, and very often now, because again of ore degradation, many of these mines go very deep down. Another one owned by the same company is about 4 kilometers deep into the earth. So these are really structurally vulnerable sites. And I've also been doing this sort of research in Chile on the Chilean mining and extraction industries. And I visited at the Center for Mathematical Modeling, which is one of the premier centers for applying big data and machine learning into the extraction industries. And I learned that computing wouldn't be just about measuring, but necessitated rethinking the entire structure of mining, the unions, laborers, the entire cycling. The hierarchies of the mines must go, business managers and analysts told me, to be instead managed by these regular feedback loops derived from billions of sensors and automated systems that sense and decide the exact best actions, the best manner to ventilate, heat, cool, dig, chemically separate, mix, dispose, and scavenge the material. I was also told that all these maths and algorithms being generated might eventually be used in asteroid and other mining. And indeed, Goldman Sachs released a report almost synchronically with my visit, arguing for the future of asteroid mining on April 6, 2017. The Sachs report was bullish on the whole endeavor. The post-planetary and our future forms of extraction already therefore in the works, being imagined here through our big data analytics systems. So these mines are the test beds, the experimental waste stations, if will, for one possible, certainly extractive and colonial future. And the result of all this smartness is that by the end of the life, this Quebec mine, which is probably will last only about 12 years, but might stretch to 25 with all this computation, is upwards of 750 million tons of waste rock, which you are now watching me drive by, and tailings, all full of sulfur and cyanide that lie outside. This also results in boom and busts as town and the regions are abandoned or left to die once the labor demands dry up. So it's a huge amount of extraction happening in a very, very condensed time. But worry not, all this will eventually be reclaimed, in this case into a golf course, so that it can look just like it did before, even if a few heavy metals are now in the water. And efforts are made, and here you can see calcium carbonate being pumped into the water before being released back into this lovely boreal forest, in order to deacidify the water, since it comes off the mines at about a pH of 2 or 3, which would kill everything. So, so basically, when I spoke to a lot of the ecologists working on these forest systems, the language they used was one of this new term titled resilience. It's not that things aren't destroyed, but that the functions, the ecosystem functions, as we like, or ecosystem services in the parlance of this particular language, are maintained. And all of this is done mostly not for jewelry. Some 60% of the gold goes right back underground. into the vaults of banks in Switzerland and London. This is the Bank of England. To act as another commodity, grounding speculation and currency. So gold is actually the infrastructure for a lot of derivative and future trading. It's the ultimate hedge bet, as been witnessed during the coronavirus, if you will, for planetary volatilities. Betting, if you will, through algorithmic modes against other forms of volatility to feed the ongoing need to liquefy the planet and hopefully bet on not so certain futures. This derivative betting through digital finance accompanies the big data transformation of the mind. These practices make crisis an impossibility. Always hedge betting it, since you're always already kind of sold your shares, so to speak, and deferring it, which blinds us to the depletion of the ecosystem and of the human costs of extraction. So despite the fact that all the mines are running out and the ore is deeply degraded, the total amounts of mining have actually increased quite heavily globally, and this is just in gold, but across the board. As the result of automation and machine learning and big data. This computation is assumed will avoid the terminal end to resources or environmental damage through increased data, better simulations, resilience, and ultimately reclamation. This indicates, if we will, a shift of economy, perhaps from extraction to a new kind of scavenge optimization. Vast arrays of sensors, ever more refined chemistry, and reorganized labor and supply chains are developed whose main function is to produce big data for machine learning that will search for speculative and financializable uses for the detritus or excrement of mining. And of course, the cyclical economy is a quite big term, and I'm not totally against it. So I'd be interested in a conversation about what terms we might have an ethical form of cyclical economy. But these computational industrial assemblages create new economies of scavenging, such as the search for other metals and tailing ponds, or the reuse of waste material for construction or other purposes, which is currently quite in vogue globally. In the meantime, all of this betting can keep going because the mines are supposedly environmentally friendly now. So we end with smart, resilient, green extraction. Now I tell you this story because it elucidates some of the challenge and possibilities of what it means to think critically and historically about media and about computational systems and bias today. First, as a historian of science, it points to histories of knowledge and power. So part of me is, when looking at these systems, what can I do? Well, I'm a historian, and the first thing I think is about remapping and re-narrativizing the site. So I'm interested in thinking about how the histories of science, geology, and ecology, and we might think here of Catherine Youssef and the questions of how these histories of extraction, colonialism, and slavery that accompany these extraction economies in the America, along with what kind of ideas of evolution and of nature are actually inherent in concepts of resilience, which have taken great potency not only in ecosystem management, but also urban management across the board, where there's a concept sort of constant volatility shock as a kind of norm. And this can be both redemptive and terrible. And it's important to recall, behind all of our theories of technology, and especially AI and learning, are concepts of evolution, as well as histories of finance and algorithms that make this site possible. I also want to take as a story that this site demonstrates how computational algorithmic technologies, such as so this site's possibility is built on these kind of markets in algorithmic technologies. We don't usually think about finance, but it's certainly one of the more critical infrastructures, if we will. But how such technologies, such as the Black-Scholes equation, that are used to get resources, and all these smart mining technologies that are used to get resources out of the increasingly fatigued earth with very low grade quality, or reformulate older extractive and settler colonial economies. So this mine is, of course, an unceded indigenous lands of the Anishinaabe Nation, a fact that needs to be kind of recognized in its reclamation. But the equations also derive from colonialism and the slave trade. Derivative markets were first used to offset insurance risk by the Dutch and then the British East India Trading Companies. Here's Calcutta Port. And here's a list of kind of these derivative pricing equations. These are the sort of first calculative techniques that you find from Lloyd's of London. These are like risk tables from the 18th century, where you could see that the more dangerous North American or West Indies trip might be recombined with, say, a Mediterranean trip in order to offset your risks. What's interesting about these charts is that they're basically a remapping of forms of new territory. You can see how the ocean itself was remapped into a territory of risk valuations. But more importantly, these were also critical technologies, as Carrick, Keeling, and a lot of other race theorists have thought, of transforming human beings into populations and commodities, now valued through this new technology that linked population and probability as a mode of actually quantifying and evaluating, kind of transforming bodies into these kind of risks and potential futures. So my first point that one learns from a site like this is that situating our digital systems is a critical first step in even mapping our geography, even thinking about the forms of time and their relationship to difference that structure the types of economy that produce these forms of extraction. So smart infrastructures point to questions about temporality and scale that we need to begin asking. Both the times of geology and the times of machines and algorithmic speculation, of course, the fragile biological life that's in between. The question continues, what are designers to do? And what do we need to, what are the new terms and concepts that we need to think about that might allow us to continue to like map and also think about both representing and intervening in these kind of systems? And in terms of scale, I've also been thinking a lot about the planetary and its relationship to older ideas of globalization. The planetary for me differs subtly from the global, and it's not about homogenization through the telecommunication networks, intensified international trade, multinational corporations and the like. In contrast to mid-20th century understandings of globalization, the planetary is about disjunctures and differential exposures to varying forms of sociological risk, as put by Bond, De Bruyn, and Rapson. It's about the integration and, in fact, arbitrage of differences between places and populations through logistical systems that do not homogenize, but rather govern through differentials, through environmental and racial inequities. So I'm deeply interested in mapping and rethinking the contours of these systems and how these sterile smart mines in Canada, so this is another mine that we're spending a lot of time studying, LeRon 5, which is a kind of fully automated LTE networked mine and a B2B. And relationship between these modes of increasing extractionism and sort of scavenge economies as they're related to other forms of like artisanal mining happening in locations like here, like in Burkina Faso, and how these global digital exchanges and commodities structure these two practices into a new kind of set of territories around these. This is kind of a mapping of global gold markets, but also how remapping these relations might also help us think about new forms of activism. So we might also ask about global assemblages and how they afford or incapacitate new forms of action, politics, and territorial imaginary. So for example, as a historian, it's important for me to understand the complex times of finance, the integration of newer logics, older histories of slavery and colonialism, and new technical infrastructures, and ask what such an examination might afford us in terms of complicating action. For example, the ways that activists are trying to shut down these pipelines through arbitrage between actors changing the risk evaluations in a new game that pits finance versus finance. On a personal level, I also work with my students and with designers, and I run a research cluster in the Anthropocene, and currently, this mine is actually part of a research studio on mine reclamation. So the question is, how shall we inhabit this catastrophe? And we're working with a mine reclamation engineer, Dr. Ben Zazua, and Alessandro Ponti at University de Montreal Architecture. And here's an image of the lab that we work in. And a lot of this data is actually electronic, but a lot of it's quite analog and homemade, these little kind of little machines that people put together to try to figure out the actual pH and runoffs. And we're trying to imagine how these different practices might be altered and how we might re-envision what it means to actually reclaim a site like this and rethink its future. So this mind, after all, poses a lot of questions about empiricism and therefore about data. As we approach this site, one of the key questions that emerges is, how do we measure? Where do we measure? And what do we measure? And what is the model of our system? How do we understand if a system is healthy or not? What's the measure of that, and for whom and how? So what data do we collect to rethink the future, and how do we visualize it and re-narrativize these data stories? So a lot of our previous studios have been a lot about trying to visualize, for example, the transformation here into artificial intelligence and high technology, how that's shifting it, but also attempting, for example, to map different legal networks around extraction. So here, these are mappings of surface versus underground property rights that are sort of negotiating these sites. So we're trying to figure out different ways to re-narrativize the site, and even what is the site, in order to begin thinking about what it would mean to reclaim and what exactly is being reclaimed. So the industry standard itself is to try and cover it up, or just to return, if you will, to the previous disrupted ecosystem. But in reality, mostly they just measure pH coming off the site. Our questions are, what sort of relation should we have with this land, with change, with the future, and with each other, and with other species? How do we actually shift this kind of model of reclamation into something else? To do this, we're hoping to bring in indigenous perspectives, feminist science studies, and critical race theory. So we're sort of taking Donna Haraway's incentive or provocation, if you will, to kind of rethink our approach, and to kind of question assumptions about making habitats resilient, and ask what a full reclamation, particularly within the histories of settler colonialism and within the kind of nature of the extraction economy, would actually denote. The question, of course, is what are the boundaries of this site and perhaps this network? And measurement and modeling are always political and ethical. It's a mechanism for producing infrastructures for different forms of life and different forms of potentials. And here's our class kind of at a pH measuring statement. And we're sort of trying to rethink that kind of very basic idea of how you measure in ecological, environmental, or systemic health. How do you introduce different histories and situated knowledge? And we take our leads a lot from other examples in Canada, such as the Indigenous Land Stewardship Circle, which is currently taking care of High Park in Toronto, and often challenging standard concepts from ecology. And these are not just questions of the hinterlands I want to end. I want to say that they provide our urban, that it's not just these outer spaces and that we can somehow bar them from our own practices, but what we measure and how we model our systems and networks plays a critical part in how we envision the future of human habitat and life, and indeed of social justice. So here's a number of examples where lately this kind of new thinking about how extending the idea of the city, challenging what the boundaries are between, say, dry land and water, between different zones, the edge between quote unquote nature and, let's say, the city. And this is another very famous example of how we've been thinking a lot about using wetlands and, if you will, different type of ecological thinking. However, one of the things that also troubles me about these sort of practices is the way that we're constantly returned to always seeing nature as sort of a reserve, something that's doing work. So can we break with languages of extraction, efficiency, optimization that so shape the extraction industries to do something else, or even the idea that these oysters have to serve us good food while they also defend us from climate change? Are there different ways to be thinking the relations between species and between different relations of difference? And so ultimately, I'm a humanist, though, so I stand on fiction and I stand on artistic and humanity's place in reminding engineering and technologists that the future is never fully determined, and in rethinking how we rework these concepts of extraction, efficiency, optimization, and even the concepts of nature that continue a kind of certain logic of extractionism, even in our smart technologies. We turn often to science fiction, so I just kind of end. I can't share this full story, but a lot of my students have been also writing science fictions in response to this mind and trying to imagine a different and produce a different sort of language for rethinking our relations to space and place and to quote unquote nature. So thank you, I'll end there.
Hello, everyone. Wow, I mean, that was amazing. Thank you so much, Ruha and Orit. Your presentations are so important and so interesting, and I think so relevant to the field of architecture. But they're not exactly what we always talk about at schools of architecture. So I really love that you're both here, and thank you to the organizers for kind of curating this session. I have maybe a couple of responses and questions. I want to get to those and also save some time for the audience Q&A. But maybe I'll first make a couple of quick, present a couple of quick notes, and then quickly show a kind of straw man project applying some of this, some of these techniques to architecture. So first, I want to mention that I think you should both have joint appointments in a school of architecture. It would be really amazing to have you in dialogue with the student projects and the research in a school of architecture. And I know some of these topics are already being addressed by various schools, but you are both so articulate about your research that I think it's really great to have you in the dialogue here. So a couple of the things that I'm thinking about, as someone who's in an architecture school and as someone who's, practicing as a designer and architect, I'm thinking, naturally about how some of these ideas might play out in architecture and the built environment. And I'm also thinking about how to make some of these complex issues legible to a public audience. And that's a topic that's relevant for all of architecture, but particularly when architecture is engaging some of these complexities. But as I mentioned, first, I'd like to kind of quickly share this project, which I'm thinking of as a kind of straw man project, to try to see what it means, both the successes and the failures of applying some of these questions and issues in an architectural installation, with the idea that maybe we can take this project and critique it or build off of it, talk about a better next version, and to think about how the fields of architecture and design, which are so promising for their potential to change things, but also so limiting in some ways because of their tie to capital, to resources, to clients, just to speak more directly in the terms of architects. And so how can we engage these kind of topics? So let me see if I can share my screen briefly here. This will just be very brief. And let's see, let me know if you can see that. Okay, it looks like I'm sharing. So what I'm going to show just really briefly is a project for the Seoul Biennale of Architecture and Urbanism called Imminent Commons, curated by Hyungmin Pai and Alejandro Zarapolo. And this is a project that we created called Twin Mirror, and it aims to explore the machine learning technology behind some of these applications that we've already seen and heard a little bit about, like surveillance, traffic flow, public health, judicial sentencing, image detection, and much more. All of these machine learning technologies that are really influencing our daily lives, and especially in ways that we sometimes don't even realize. So this was on our mind when we were exploring some of this. And I'm going to give you a sense. Here you can see the project in action. I'll try to describe it in just a couple minutes. So the project is called Twin Mirror, and it basically consists of an installation where visitors approach a display, their face is detected through image detection, and they see themselves presented back through two versions of artificial intelligence, two versions of reality. And you see the left-hand side and the right-hand side there. And more specifically, we created two different machine learning models based on two different sets of data. The first is a data set that's become a kind of academic and industry standard. It's called Labeled Faces in the Wild, and it consists of about 13,000 images of people who are mainly politicians, athletes, and celebrities. So this data set obviously has bias because of the kind of people it includes. Now, the second data set is captured from the people who visit the exhibit. So this data set may be more reflective of a specific community, but it's also biased because of the types of people it includes. So the exhibit shows back to the viewer these two versions of reality through a kind of twin mirror. Neither version of reality is neutral or objective. Both are biased. And we think that by seeing them together, we may be able to get under the hood a little bit, to apply some judgment to these kinds of technologies, maybe to become a little suspicious at times and to recognize their flaws. And then in addition to the gallery component, we also show this project on the streets in the urban life of the city of Seoul, in dialogue with other digital billboards and dynamic LED facades. So this was our attempt to try to take some of these technologies, get under the hood and use them a little bit ourselves, and also see what architecture could play in them, what role design could play in them, granted in the somewhat limited context of a biennale, of a temporary installation. So I think this project, is a way that's aiming to study data and bias, to consider how machine learning intersects with architecture, and to somehow make it visible to a public audience. But of course, the project also reveals some challenges, including just kind of getting our heads around the complexity of the technologies involved, trying to communicate that or visualize that, like we heard a little bit about earlier. And how do we do that? What are our strengths, but what are also our limits as architects and designers in this realm? So I'll stop the share now, and I'd like to kind of transition this maybe to an initial kind of question, and maybe we can hear a little bit of reflection from both of you, and try to tie some threads together. And so I think first I had in mind to talk a little more specifically about the tools we're using. So these are, some of the tools of machine learning. That's certainly one of them. We could also talk about the tools of optimization. And partly what I'm thinking about is, we've explored a little bit some of the effects of the tools, and I want to come back to that. But I also want to talk about the tools themselves, including how they work and who made them. And here I'm reflecting back on a comment that really struck me from a friend of mine and a colleague formerly at Columbia with me, who's a computer scientist. His name is Eitan Greenspan, really fascinating guy. And he noted to me in a different public event that he said, and I think this is pretty much a quote, architects have been hijacked by computer scientists, meaning that they're using tools that they themselves didn't necessarily, they certainly didn't write the tools. Maybe they didn't invent them, and maybe they didn't even ask for them, at least directly. So maybe that's an overstatement, maybe not, but I want to transition that into something maybe more active and ask both of you to reflect on how important you think it is for architects and designers, or for sociologists or historians of science for that matter, how important it is for these people to be able to get under the hood, to understand all the technical details of how machine learning works, and to maybe even be able to tinker with them or write alternatives or suggest feature changes. Is this something that you think about? I mean, both of you have offered these great things I'm going to come back to as ways that we can be more active in this context, that we can become more of pattern makers, that we can do these case studies and expose these things. But I wonder if you have, if you have thoughts. I mean, especially in this context with all of these, you know, bright and kind of designers and architects tuning in to see this session. How important is it for all architects to really be fluent in this language of algorithms?
Yeah, I think my own thinking around this is that it's great if an individual can have multiple fluencies and have the kind of architectural, the sociological, the historical, but at the same time, realistically, we can't all do and know everything. And so to me, one of the workarounds is to think about what kind of teams we want to have, what forms of expertise, disciplinary and otherwise, do we want around the table as we're both building and adopting tools. And to have that expertise around the table is vital. And at the same time, I do think in conversations about data and bias, the technological literacy or know-how is, I think, too often overemphasized, and the social and historical literacy and know-how, because of the hierarchies of knowledge that map our own universities, those are often either discounted or people assume they rely on their common sense, I think, too often, rather than taking seriously the disciplinary knowledge when it comes to the social sciences and the humanities that are just as necessary. And so when we talk about understanding the tools that we use, I also thought when you posed the question about how the social tools, how we often are using various conceptual and social tools without really understanding them. And I write about how race itself is a technology that we often employ in our work by relying on common sense notions without understanding what's under the hood of race. Whereas there's an imperative to understand what's in the black box of the algorithm. And so I would really encourage us to include in our repertoire or in our toolkit a respect for and a honing of the social and conceptual tools, as much as we want to have expertise around the hardware and the software and the algorithms. And the last thing I'll say is that I think in the same way that you described computer science kind of taking over architecture, I write a little bit in chapter 5 of Race After Technology of how design thinking has taken over almost everything. And so that's an example of a conceptual tool that in some ways we could say has colonized or infected or created a hegemony, whatever language you want to use, in which we talk about so many things in the language of and through the lens of design thinking without enough reflexivity and enough kind of thinking about where did that come from? Who does it serve, etc. And so I love the question, and I would just expand it to include things in addition to algorithms and automated systems.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I'll just make one quick observation, and then Uri, obviously you should offer your thoughts. But this idea of bringing together teams that no one can have all of the literacies, but we should have teams with all the literacies. I think that's really critical and actionable, you know, for designers, for architects. And I think I'm hoping, I tend to be optimistic, maybe too much so, while still being, you know, concerned and critical. But I think this new generation, that's more natural to, you know, to know that they need teams, to be more likely to collaborate, to be less, you know, aiming for the solitary genius model. So this offers a good, you know, practical way to do that.
Yeah, I would just second what Ruha said, although I would also urge from usually a sense of humility or humbleness, I guess. Like, no team will have all the knowledge. I think that's also like partial perspective is key, and also reflexivity, because there is a constant valorization at certain sites or certain types of knowledge over others that serves also a deeply political function. So, so I basically am a huge supporter of interdisciplinary teams under the, you know, I can only repeat, you know, it's already been so well said, but I'm also interested in the kind of what it means to design or offer suggestions with a kind of, not humble, but yeah, like a lack of authority, really. That
Yeah,
that's kind of the history of where all the positivism went, but
well, that's interesting, because I was thinking of going a little bit in that direction next. You know, this is maybe an oversimplified question, but I'm wondering if there is a kind of, if we can return to some like what we might call antidotes to the kind of insidious effects of bias and data and algorithms. And so maybe humility would be one good antidote along those lines. But I was thinking, just picking up some of the terms from your talks, that imagination, activism, pattern making, visualization, you know, that these can be tools, you know, or kind of antidotes or ways to counterbalance some of what we encounter. But I wonder if you have other thoughts about what we should be looking for or striving for.
Yeah, and it builds off of Ord's point. You know, thinking about one of the, whether it's antidote or ways forward, is really incorporating as essential a power analysis in whatever we do. A power both in terms of thinking about the relationship between knowledge and power, and also just like old school power, like in terms of social and political power, and really thinking about how pre-existing hierarchies, pre-existing power dynamics shape every step of the process, including, and I would urge us to really think about how our starting questions in terms of what we want architecture or design or technology to solve or to intervene in, the question that we're posing before we pick up any tool, before we develop any team, that question is already weighted with certain forms of power that are overdetermined by history and by our current, like, you know, social order. And so really thinking through how at the point of posing questions, we can begin to subvert power, subvert the typical ways of thinking and doing things, rather than waiting until downstream, further along the process, where already there's momentum and already it's harder to turn left or right. thinking at the starting point, what does that look like to begin to have a rigorous power analysis at the point of posing questions, because that leads us down certain rabbit holes and away from others, depending on how we're framing whatever the thing is we want to build, who it's going to serve. And even that word client, thinking about what it means to privilege the client versus other publics or other users already sets us down certain trajectories. And so I think that there's a lot we can do very early in the process.
Yeah, I mean, I would concur. I mean, I don't have any like solutions, but I know that I like to create situations like as a pedagogical tool. Like it's a particular problem to have to envision the future of this mine or what have you, and incorporate different opinions from indigenous groups or from people who are in the communities that are reliant on these extraction industries, or even from the machine learning people who are developing the geology. But I think at a fundamental start point, there's really a question about having to produce also vocabulary, because it's hard to envision a reclamation or a smartness project or whatever that, you know, how do you get away from that question about like ecosystem services, or like certain ideas about optimization, efficiency. This came in Ruha's discussion as well, that once you fundamentally have those locked in, you're going to be developing like a racist and equitous system. Like already from the start, you've built in a series of premises. So I don't have any like one-step solutions, but I think that there's ways to put people in situated knowledge situations where they actually have to contend with that as designers, or, you know, and that's the closest, you know, that's my suggestion or my strategy right now.
Oh, sorry. And Orit, do you, could you connect that? Would you want to connect that to a so-called good version of circularity? I thought it was interesting that you
the critique of the circular economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really relevant. It's really relevant for this audience, for me personally. You know, so what would be the start of that? Because I know it's like not fair to ask you for solutions to these big
to everything
problems. But
I mean,
well, to circularity, like how would we start? Like, what would be the start of getting a better version of circular economy?
Well, that's in the particular case of the mining situation, like you're starting with a premise that the circular economy will allow more mining to commence. So you have kind of an impossible scenario there from certain environmental or ecological or human rights concerns. And I guess one of the questions about like the circular economy, I mean, it's always this economy for whom, for what, and then there's always that term economy that at the end of the day has to be taken up, and you have to ask, where is value actually being assigned here? Now, there's different circular economies, and for this reason, like I'm actually very interested. You know, I don't throw out environmental movements who use financial strategies to like stop pipelines or what have you, even if on the whole I may have a critique of those instruments. Like, and I really like what Ruha said, not only about pattern making, but about understanding that every time you see an assemblage, you have more opportunities for action. Same thing with the circular economy. When we understand certain things about what's histories of economy or histories of the fantasy of like perfect recycling or what have you, but we can also capture them. And there's more sites of entry in that economy. But again, you know, you'd have to give me a specific case. I wouldn't say like writ large, it's a bad or good thing. I think it has to do with what's being assigned value and where and for what, and what other relations, frankly, of labor of production between human beings and non-humans as well are being set up in whatever economy of circularity you have.
Yeah, yeah, I think that makes sense. I know there are a couple of questions coming in the Q&A, so if audience members have other questions, please type them in, and I want to go to those in just one second. But I wanted, maybe the last question I wanted to throw out is, I guess I've been thinking a lot about what could be our levers of change. So where could we start in these big, complex, difficult problems? And, we could just, note a few, but I think everyone knows, where we're going with this, the crisis of the pandemic, the crisis of climate change, the crisis of inequality, the crisis of racial justice, the economic crisis, if we are going to be inclusive. So these are all, these huge systemic things, a lot of complexity and a lot of work to do. But I wonder if we can think about what are the levers? I don't know, maybe I'm just giving myself in different words here, looking for a kind of action or mentality that the audience can take away. But I guess more specifically, I'm thinking like, what are the levers that would start to amplify our effort, with the lever effect in creating some beneficial change? And here now, maybe I'm thinking like education could be a lever, because that has a big kind of lever effect. It's like a kind of pyramid scheme almost, right? Regulation can be the lever, I think. Activism, but then also imagination, right? And I think, Ruha, you brought that up in such a exciting way. So do you have thoughts about like about those kind of levers and the combination of them?
Yeah, you've hit on a lot of them. So I often say that for me, my ground zero is really thinking about pedagogy and education. That's why I loved what Ori said earlier. For me, that's the groundwork where we seed alternatives, where we begin to plant in the minds and hearts of students, just encouraging ways of thinking outside the box, thinking beyond, certain kinds of boundaries. And so that to me is definitely like my own playground, but I acknowledge that both regulation, policy, like that's why I pointed to the Algorithmic Accountability Bill, is just a placeholder for thinking about that whole pathway of protections that have to be fostered in order to transform the ecosystem in which we develop technology, and then organizing both among professionals and people who work in a particular sector, in this case, tech organizing, but also more grassroots organizing, community organizing as the, two nodes in that kind of push for change. And so I mentioned a few organizations that are emblematic of that kind of work that I see has really been flowering over the last few years. And then to think about the arts in the most expansive sense, which to me is around imagination, but really an explosive understanding of what the arts are, not just people who consider them professional artists, but really, we might even say cultural workers, really thinking about how to have us question and create different kinds of norms and values. And so there's a lot of great work that are more explicitly creative, subversive projects around technology and design that I often like to talk about in longer versions of the talk, that I talk about a little in the book, but also just thinking about speculation more broadly. I'm teaching a class now called Black Mirror, Race, Technology, and Justice. And for their practicum, they're working on a speculative design project around COVID and race, in which they're taking a lot of the conceptual tools that we've been reading about and actually applying them in a project that requires them to build that muscle of imagination. And it's so funny today when they were in their breakout groups, I posed the question. I said, can you have a conversation among your group whether you're still bounding yourself within our current reality, like they're building all of these things around current constraints? And I was like, or are you pushing the boundaries? Like, are you really trying to have at least one dimension that is in a near future that you can imagine? And it's so hard, I think, especially for people who are successful in our academic, our academic structure, that the imaginative muscle has atrophied in some ways. And so it's like, let's think about what it looks like. Otherwise, we'll continue to build new versions of the same old thing, like the same systems, the same apps that have a different gloss, but that have the same underlying power and social dimensions. And so for me as a teacher, it's vital to build in imagination, speculation into my pedagogy. And I think also that characterizes a lot of great organizing work as well. The ability to imagine a different future is science fictional. And so I think that these categories that I've outlined really blend together in important ways as well.
Yeah, I can repeat. I mean, for me, obviously, pedagogy is the first start, and particularly public education. I think there's actually a real question about producing the infrastructures of possibility for all human beings, and that continues to be a primary and central concern, particularly right now. Particularly, I also think that it's pretty important to stick with the sort of logic of like billion black Anthropocenes. Like, this is not a crisis. Like, the crisis has happened for lots of people for a very long time. And it's important to start recognizing that. And the discourse of crisis often facilitates a survivalist discourse that makes certain things in certain lives and certain types of knowledge sacrificable. And I find that intolerable. And I think it's really important for us to stand on that. And particularly not only to stand on the place and the centrality of public education, but also different forms of knowledge, particularly under the duress of STEM. So I think that there's also a really important place for that. But I'm actually mostly like really positive in the sense of like, I'm in a place where we're really into this thing called research creation. And it's really, I think, about trying to bring people together in the arts and the humanities and social sciences and the sciences to kind of think collectively and think differently, and to have to deal with different types of collective problems. And I'm kind of seeing that happening a lot. Around climate, around race, around different stuff. So I'm not, it's a lot of repetition on what Ruha is saying, but I really see about the incredible potency of pedagogy, but I also understand that pedagogy does link to politics in terms of being fundamentally committed to plural democracy, which is a really difficult thing to continue to envision, but to continue to also kind of fight for within the university and outside of it. And I don't know, I mean, for me, that's mostly what I do. And I also really have to say that there's an ongoing place to really inform, also to have a bridge between the arts and the humanities and the social sciences and engineering and design. I mean, I think that that's where a lot of the cut happens. So there's kind of a really critical lot of work that needs to be done to kind of bridge that. I think it's pretty potent to have people be thinking about their practices reflexively. It's an opportunity, their education, to do that. And then, I mean, I think there's so many other places, of course, of activism and activity. And I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said about imagination, but yes, and ultimately, like, I believe that re-narrativization, meaning making and fiction producing, is like the potent tools we have really at this juncture to envision a world other than we have right now.
Yeah, well said. I want to, I know we have to wrap up, and I apologize because I think I did a bad job of turning to the Q&A from this box here, although I've been taking a look and I think several of the questions were addressed. And several were answered directly, and several were also addressed in the discussion. But maybe just to end with one question that I don't think we addressed yet, although a little bit. And it's the last question in the box now. Do you think the social dynamics, digital literacy, and societal needs will be more open to change post-COVID?
Oh man, I'm a historian. I'm not supposed to tell the future. You can make stuff up.
I think we're at a crossroads. I think they can be more open. I can see a way forward that they're more open, but I also see, the way that this has created an opening for the people who want to re-entrench power and monopolize resources. And so it's an opening from below, but also from above, to fill a vacuum and to use the crisis as a way to fill it with tech fixes and other short-term solutions that will just maintain the status quo and perhaps even deepen. I think we're seeing a real deepening of inequality and social domination. If we just look at a simple we can look at many figures, but one figure is just to look at the rising unemployment rate next to the increasing net worth of the richest handful of people. And if you just look at those numbers side by side, you see a widening of the gap that that I think all of the mutual aid in the world can't fill, as heartening as that work is. And so I think we have to stay both sober and also hopeful in terms of what's possible at this crossroads.
I'm always a pessimistic optimist. So, I would be doing what I'm doing if I didn't think things would get better. But to follow Ra, I'm obsessed with finance, and there wasn't too much of a crisis there, but there was a massive reallocation of a capital, and so there's an opportunity here, definitely, to reflexively question the infrastructures actually of society. This was an infrastructural problem that really highlighted structural violences, inequity, environmental destruction, all these things, whether it's the racism in terms of who died from this and who did not, or whether it's the causes of it, which, fundamentally also around environmental and other issues. But again, I think part of that is also fighting really hard to keep the possibility open rather than foreclosing the future, which I think is part of also not creating any easy solutions. How do we get, for me right now, I'm really obsessed, how do we create a politics of uncertainty, actually? How do you get people to be ready to deal with diverse possible future and with diversity that forecloses actually having that kind of a surety that the right offers? So I'm really interested and invested in that, but pessimistically optimistic.
Okay, well, good way to conclude. My quick summary might be that it does seem to be a moment of reset, and I think, maybe it's a moment to be pessimistically optimistic, but it's going to take work. It's going to take work to take advantage of that reset moment. And one final observation is that I think both of you are making me think that that we are citizens. So we are, of course, workers and professionals and academics, but we're also citizens. And I think that's important for me to remember as an architect, when we often, kind of claim that, oh, well, we're not controlling the situation here, we're just doing the job, we need to get paid, et cetera. But there have been some examples, including the tech examples of kind of declaring what you will do, what you won't do, of being citizens, in these collaborative teams, in making decisions, based on values. So I know, Shelby, we have to wrap up, I know, and I think you want to maybe invite people to continue the discussion in the happy hour.
First, I want to invite everyone to the Murmur, I think the purple Murmur room, if you'd like to come for an informal happy hour and a chat. And I want to just thank you, Ruha, and Benjamin again, or David, I'm sorry, two Benjamins in one room. And really reluctant to end this conversation just because it's been so powerful, but also thinking of it as a beginning in the sense that I do think computational design is one of the many hinges that are available between STEM and the humanities. And so I hope that the community can take this more as a starting point to carry forward these conversations. But I just want to thank you again. I'm grateful for your perspectives on the entanglements of data and bias, of which there are many. And I wish this conversation could go on for hours, but also would like to be respectful of your time. So thank you again for joining us, especially just during the complexities of COVID. I think these conversations are even more important than ever. And I'm going to plug tomorrow's events, where we're going to continue into paper sessions, another award project, and a keynote on automation and agency, as in addition to a special session on architects' response with the production of PPE during COVID. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us this evening. And if we could at least give a small round of applause for Ruha, Orit, and David, and thank them again for coming.
Thank you.
And when we hit the end on the webinar, it's all going to disappear. So thank you again. Bye, guys.